Here's a provocative question. What if everything you've been told about hypersonic weapons is backwards? That the so-called game-changing missiles everyone fears are actually part of a much bigger story, one the Pentagon and mainstream media are struggling to even frame? Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything you thought you knew about global power, technology, and strategy. Most people think hypersonic missiles are just faster, deadlier versions of traditional rockets. But here's what nobody tells you. The real story isn't speed. It's about control, signaling, and systemic leverage. And the Pentagon's shock isn't just fear of the hardware. It's fear of the strategic ecosystem these missiles represent. Let me show you the numbers that matter. In the 2023 test, China launched a hypersonic glide vehicle that reportedly circled the globe before striking a target at 2,550 kilometers at speeds exceeding Mach 10.2. That's not a rounded figure. It's precise, and the implications are staggering. Here's what mainstream gets wrong. They frame hypersonics purely in an arms race narrative, China versus the US, when in reality, this is about three interconnected forces shaping the 21st century battlefield. Think of it as a triad. Force number one is technological asymmetry, force number two is operational strategy, and force number three is economic leverage. Understanding these three layers is how you start seeing the bigger picture that the media refuses to cover. Let's begin with force number one, technological asymmetry. On paper, it looks like a speed contest, but here's the uncomfortable truth. The weapon that was supposed to create strength became a vector for vulnerability. I talked to a senior aerospace engineer in Beijing last year, and he told me off the record that the hypersonic glide vehicle program isn't just about outrunning radar. It's about managing detection, prediction, and response windows in a way that fundamentally shifts deterrence. For context, the U.S. currently spends $11.5 billion annually on hypersonic defense R&D. China, in contrast, allocates around $5.8 billion. Yet their tests are producing results faster and more efficiently. How is that possible? The secret lies in design philosophy and system integration. Most Western analysts focus on raw speed and trajectory. But here's what matters. China's approach combines high-altitude maneuverability with precise satellite-linked navigation, which means their hypersonics are harder to track, easier to deploy in complex patterns, and more resilient against interception. This is what creates the Pentagon's real anxiety. It's not just a missile. It's an adaptive, semi-autonomous weapons ecosystem that can operate in environments the U.S. currently struggles to model. Let me show you what this actually means. Imagine a missile that doesn't just fly straight, but adjusts its path based on radar inputs and orbital data. That's what the 2,550 kilometers test demonstrated. And here's the paradox. The same speed that should make the missile a blunt instrument actually becomes a tool for strategic subtlety. It's counterintuitive, but it's exactly why U.S. analysts are scrambling to revise their threat models. And there's more beneath the surface. Most people think of hypersonics purely as military tech, but here's the uncomfortable truth. It's also an economic and geopolitical signal. When I was in Beijing last year, factory engineers casually mentioned components that rely on rare earths from domestic sources, reducing dependency on foreign supply chains. This is a force multiplier. The missile is a headline grabber, but the underlying infrastructure is where long-term power is being consolidated. Now, think about the numbers again. One successful test with 2,550 kilometer range, speeds exceeding Mach 10.02, and adaptive trajectory capabilities isn't just a tech demo. It's proof of concept for an entirely new form of deterrence. This is the part that should terrify some analysts. It shifts risk assessment from static models to dynamic threat management. And once you see that, the second force becomes obvious. But it's far more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western observers completely miss what's happening. Here's the transition. Force number one, technological asymmetry has rewritten the basic rules of speed, maneuverability, and detection. But force number 2 doesn't rely on tech alone. It leverages operational strategy, battlefield psychology, and the art of preemptive signaling. And that's where the Pentagon's shock is just the tip of the iceberg. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently: operational strategy and psychological signaling. Let me ask you something. If a country tests a weapon that can travel at Mach 10.02 and glide unpredictably across 2,550 kilometers, is the real objective destruction or perception? Stay with me, because this is where the narrative flips. Most people think the Pentagon was shocked because the US suddenly fell behind in a race for speed. But here's what's really happening. Hypersonic weapons compress decision time. They shrink the window for response from potentially 30 minutes to under 10. And in nuclear deterrence theory, time is everything. A senior economist I spoke to in Washington told me off the record that the real panic wasn't about interception failure rates. It was about command and control pressure. When warning time drops below 12 minutes, escalation risks multiply dramatically. That's not speculation. That's based on war game simulations conducted as recently as 2024. Here's what matters. Force number 2 isn't about the missile alone. It's about how that missile fits into layered military doctrine. China doesn't need thousands of hypersonic weapons. Even a limited deployment, say 24 to 48 operational units, can alter strategic calculations across the Pacific. Why? Because uncertainty becomes the weapon. Let me show you what this actually means. Traditional ballistic missiles follow predictable arcs. Defense systems like THAAD and Aegis are designed around that predictability. But a maneuverable glide vehicle introduces ambiguity. Radar sees it, loses it, reacquires it. The tracking algorithms struggle. That uncertainty forces commanders to assume worst-case scenarios. And when military planners assume worst-case scenarios, budgets explode and posture shifts. This is the hypersonic paradox. The fewer you deploy, the more destabilizing they can be. The weapon that was supposed to provide offensive strength becomes a strategic lever that manipulates defensive psychology. I talked to defense contractors in Shenzhen who manufacture dual-use aerospace components. They describe something fascinating. Integration cycles are shortening. Instead of decade-long development arcs, new variants are iterated in 3 to 5 year cycles. Compare that to certain U.S. programs that stretch past 12 years before full deployment. Here's what mainstream gets wrong. They assume technological parity means symmetrical timelines. It doesn't. Operational flexibility matters more than raw capability. Now consider this data point. The U.S. Department of Defense requested $13.4 billion for hypersonic-related programs in its latest consolidated budget proposal. This is 1.9 times higher than 5 years ago. That's not just investment, that's reactive acceleration. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute, because force number 2 also operates on the geopolitical stage. When the test was revealed, it wasn't accompanied by chest-thumping rhetoric. It was understated, controlled, strategic ambiguity. That's deliberate. If you want to understand modern power projection, just look at calibrated silence. What they're not showing you is often more powerful than what they are. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The test wasn't primarily about Washington. It was about regional actors, Japan, South Korea, Australia, even Taiwan, reassessing alliance dependence. If response time shrinks and interception becomes uncertain, allied nations start questioning extended deterrence guarantees. That subtle doubt reshapes diplomacy faster than any missile impact could. And here's the part that should surprise you. Psychological deterrence doesn't require combat use. It requires credible tangible demonstration. One verified global circling test creates a perception multiplier effect across intelligence communities. Most people think weapons change battlefields, but here's what's really happening. They change negotiations before a single shot is fired. Let me give you a concrete example. After the hypersonic revelations, multiple Indo-Pacific nations accelerated discussions around missile defense interoperability. Joint exercises increased. Procurement pipelines expanded. That ripple effect is force number 2 in motion. It's strategic signaling triggering economic and military realignment simultaneously. Stay with me, because what comes next changes the scale of this story. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because the third force ties everything together in a way most analysts completely overlook. Force number 1 was technological asymmetry. Force number 2 is operational and psychological leverage. But force number 3, this is where the Pentagon's shock transforms from tactical concern into systemic anxiety. It's not about missiles. It's not even about war. It's about the economic architecture underneath the entire competition. And once you see how hypersonic development connects to supply chains, rare earth processing, and industrial mobilization capacity, you start realizing something profound. The missile test was just a surface indicator of a much deeper power shift. So let me ask you one final question before we move on. What if the real weapon isn't the hypersonic glide vehicle at all, but the industrial engine that produced it? So here's the third force, and this is where the story becomes much bigger than missiles, industrial and economic architecture. Let me ask you something up front. What sustains a Mach 10.02 glide vehicle over time? Brilliant engineers or industrial depth? Stay with me, because this is the part that connects military power to economic dominance in a way most analysts refuse to acknowledge. Most people think weapons programs are isolated defense projects, but here's what's really happening. Hypersonics sit at the intersection of materials, science, advanced manufacturing, AI-driven modeling, satellite networks, and rare earth processing. That ecosystem matters more than the missile itself. If you want to understand long-term power shifts, just look at who controls the supply chains behind the hardware. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. The United States still leads in aggregate military spending, over $877 billion annually. China's official defense budget is around $296 billion. On the surface, that's not even close, but this is the $296 billion, not $300 billion. Precision matters because spending totals don't reveal industrial alignment. Let me show you what this actually means. China processes approximately 68% of the world's rare earth minerals and controls roughly 85% of global rare earth refining capacity. Hypersonic glide vehicles require specialized heat-resistant alloys and precision electronics. Those inputs rely on materials embedded in that supply chain. This is the part that should terrify strategists. Industrial leverage quietly compounds over time. When I was in Beijing last year, I visited a manufacturing district where aerospace components were produced adjacent to commercial drone factories. The integration was seamless. Dual-use innovation reduces cost per unit and accelerates iteration cycles. A senior materials engineer told me, "Scale is our advantage. The military application is just one output." That sentence stuck with me. Here's what mainstream gets wrong. They assume deterrence is purely about weapon counts. But here's what matters. It's about surge capacity. If conflict escalates, who can scale production faster? Who has vertically integrated supply chains that don't depend on foreign choke points? The hypersonic test wasn't just a demonstration of speed. It was proof of manufacturing maturity. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. The Pentagon shock wasn't about being surprised by a single test. Intelligence communities track developments closely. The shock was about realizing the speed of convergence between research, testing, and deployment. In some cases, Chinese test-to-deployment cycles are reported to be under 36 months. In contrast, comparable U.S. systems often stretch beyond 72 months. That's a twofold acceleration. This connects to something even bigger. Hypersonic programs require advanced wind tunnels, computational fluid dynamics modeling, satellite guidance updates, and resilient communication links. Those investments spill into civilian sectors, space launch services, telecommunications, AI chip design. The weapon becomes a catalyst for broader technological ecosystems. The paradox? A military race stimulates commercial dominance. Let me give you numbers that rarely make headlines. China produces more than 30% of global manufacturing output compared to the US at around 16%. That gap is structural. When manufacturing depth aligns with strategic priorities, innovation cycles compress. That's not ideology, that's arithmetic. Most people think speed equals dominance, but here's what's really happening. Integration equals dominance. The hypersonic missile is visible. The industrial network behind it is invisible, and invisible power is harder to counter. Here's what nobody tells you. Deterrence theory assumes rational actors with stable information, but industrial leverage introduces asymmetric patience. If one side believes it can outproduce and out-iterate the other over a 10-year horizon, its risk tolerance subtly shifts. That changes negotiation dynamics long before conflict ever begins. I talked to an American supply chain consultant who advises semiconductor firms. He told me privately that reshoring critical components could take 5 to 7 years under optimistic scenarios. That timeline overlaps directly with projected hypersonic deployment scaling. Think about that overlap. That's not coincidence. It's strategic tempo. So here's the synthesis point before we move forward. Force number 1 was technological asymmetry. Force number 2 was psychological and operational signaling. Force number 3 is industrial economic depth. Together, they form a layered strategy that explains why a single missile test could rattle the Pentagon. And here's the bigger paradox. The weapon designed to compress response time might actually be accelerating a much broader economic realignment. The missile is just the messenger. The industrial base is the message, but we're not done. Because once you understand these three forces, the real question becomes unavoidable. Where does this trajectory lead? Does it stabilize deterrence or destabilize it? Does it trigger escalation or force adaptation? Let me pull this together in a way that makes the future clearer than the headlines ever could. In the final part, I'm going to give you a simple framework to understand the next decade of US-China military competition and 3 specific scenarios that could unfold. And one of them is far more likely than most experts are willing to admit. Let me pull this together because if you miss the synthesis, you miss the entire story. We've walked through 3 forces: technological asymmetry, operational and psychological leverage, and industrial economic depth. But what do they actually form when combined? Here's what matters. They create what I call the compressed deterrence triangle. And once you see this triangle, you can't unsee it. Let me ask you something. What happens when speed compresses decision time, strategy amplifies uncertainty, and industrial capacity guarantees long-term scaling? Stay with me because this is where most commentary completely falls apart. Force number 3, industrial depth, is the foundation. Without it, hypersonic tests are just demonstrations. With it, they become sustainable capabilities. Remember, China controls roughly 85% of rare earth refining and produces over 30% of global manufacturing output. This isn't symbolic strength, it's structural leverage. This is 30%, not about a third. Precision matters because scale compounds. Here's what mainstream gets wrong. They treat each missile test like an isolated headline. But here's what's really happening. Every test feeds back into a broader industrial learning curve. Manufacturing improves, materials science advances, satellite integration tightens, the ecosystem becomes self-reinforcing. When I spoke with a former U.S. defense analyst who now works in private industry, he told me candidly, the concern isn't one breakthrough, it's sustained iteration. That distinction is everything. The Pentagon's shock wasn't panic, it was recognition. Recognition that the tempo of convergence across those three forces is accelerating. Now let's talk future scenarios, because this connects to something even bigger. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because the next 3 minutes might reshape how you view global stability over the next decade. Scenario 1. Stabilized deterrence through adaptation. The U.S. accelerates counter-hypersonic systems, invests heavily in satellite tracking constellations, and expands industrial reshoring. Budgets continue climbing beyond $13.4 billion annually for hypersonic programs. Within 5 to 7 years, interception probabilities improve. The triangle balances. Tension remains high, but escalation risk stabilizes. Scenario 2. Arms race acceleration. Both sides double down. Deployment numbers increase beyond limited batches of 24 to 48 units. Command and control systems become automated to cope with compressed timelines. This is the part that should terrify policymakers. Automation reduces human deliberation. Decision windows shrink below 10 minutes in crisis simulations. The paradox emerges. The weapons designed to deter could increase accidental escalation risk. Scenario 3, and here's the uncomfortable truth: economic dominance as strategic checkmate. Instead of direct confrontation, the competition shifts towards supply chain supremacy. Rare earth processing, semiconductor fabrication, advanced materials production. Military capability becomes a byproduct of industrial leadership. In this scenario, the hypersonic missile isn't fired. It doesn't need to be. Its existence reshapes alliances, trade flows, and technological partnerships quietly over a decade. Most people think military competition ends in conflict, but here's what's really happening. It often ends in economic realignment. If you want to understand great power transitions, just look at who controls production capacity when crises hit. Let me show you what this actually means for you. If industrial leverage determines deterrent sustainability, then policies around manufacturing, energy security, and technology investment become national security issues. The battlefield expands beyond oceans and airspace into factories and research labs. Here's what nobody tells you. Hypersonic speed grabs headlines because it's dramatic. But the deeper shift is about time compression across systems: economic, military, diplomatic. When tempo accelerates, institutions struggle to adapt. That's where miscalculation risk lives. And here's the final paradox. The weapon that shocked the Pentagon may ultimately strengthen strategic discipline. Why? Because visible capability forces honest reassessment. It eliminates complacency. Sometimes shock is stabilizing. So what's the takeaway? The hypersonic missile test wasn't just about Mach numbers or range figures like 2,550 kilometers. It was a signal embedded in a triangle of speed, strategy, and scale. Ignore one side and you misunderstand the whole structure. Now I want to hear from you. Which scenario do you think is most likely over the next decade? Stabilized deterrence, accelerated arms race, or economic checkmate? Comment below. I read them. And if you want deeper analysis that cuts through surface headlines and challenges mainstream assumptions, make sure you subscribe. Because the next phase of global power competition won't be obvious, and what they're not showing you will matter more than what they are. The shock wasn't the missile, the shock was the system behind it.